It was one of those long, lonely nights that stretched into the void of endless darkness. The type of night where silence hangs thick in the air, and the wind whispers secrets to the trees. Jack had just finished his shift at the old bookstore on the corner of 5th and Main. He always worked late on Fridays, organizing the stacks, closing the register, and locking the doors. It was routine mundane, even until the night he first noticed the shadow. The clock struck midnight as Jack turned the key to lock up, the streetlights casting a dim glow on the quiet street. As he adjusted his coat and prepared for the walk home, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He felt something shift in the air, a subtle disturbance, like the sensation of being watched. Shrugging it off, Jack set out down the road, his footsteps echoing against the deserted pavement. But then he noticed it just at the edge of his vision. A shadow, darker than the night, slinking along the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was his own, stretching out from the feeble glow of the street lamps. But something was off. The shadow moved when he stood still, flickered when he turned away, and seemed to follow him, hovering at the very periphery of his sight. Jack quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. There was nothing there, only the empty street behind him. Yet, the shadow persisted, trailing him like a black smear against the ground, shifting and sliding between the lampposts. It was as if the darkness itself had gained sentience and was trailing his every move. "Just your imagination," Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. "You're just tired, that's all." But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling. The shadow was not his. It was too independent, too fluid in its movements. And when he finally dared to stop and stare at it directly, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The shadow had eyes. Pale, white eyes, peering up at him from the ground. Eyes that seemed to blink and shift in the darkness, regarding him with a cold, indifferent hunger. Jack stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The eyes vanished the moment he tried to focus on them, dissolving back into the formless void. Shaking his head, he turned and bolted, sprinting down the street without looking back. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, finally skidding to a halt at the entrance to his apartment complex. Gasping for breath, Jack glanced behind him. There was no shadow in sight. No eyes. Nothing but the pale glow of streetlights reflecting off the rain-slicked road. He forced himself to laugh, a nervous, shaky sound that barely escaped his lips. He was being ridiculous. Of course, there was no shadow following him. He was overtired and paranoid, that's all. Resolving to forget the strange encounter, Jack slipped into his apartment, locking the door behind him. But that night, as he lay in bed, something kept him awake. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whispering noise, like the rustling of dry leaves or the soft scrape of nails against wood. Jack turned on his side, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the corner of his room. Slowly, he sat up, his eyes scanning the darkness. And there it was again, that shadow, darker than any absence of light, pooling in the farthest corner of his bedroom. It slithered along the walls, creeping closer inch by inch. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice wavering. There was no response. Only the whispering, growing louder, filling the room with an insidious, mind-numbing hum. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the lamp on his bedside table. He flicked it on, flooding the room with bright, warm light. But the shadow didn't vanish. It only recoiled slightly, shrinking back into the corner, its edges quivering as if agitated. Summoning his courage, Jack stood up, taking a cautious step toward it. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice barely more than a croak. The shadow shuddered, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a shape forming within it, something humanoid, twisted and hunched, with those same pale eyes staring out at him from the void. It didn't speak, didn't move, but Jack could feel its intentions as clearly as if it had whispered them into his ear. It wanted him. It wanted to take his place. Fear surged through him, and Jack lunged forward, swinging his arm through the shadow as if trying to swat away smoke. But his hand passed through empty air, the darkness rippling and reforming as if mocking him. He stumbled back, his gaze darting around the room. He had to get out of this apartment, away from whatever this thing was. Grabbing his keys, Jack fled, not bothering to turn off the lights or lock the door behind him. He ran into the night, not stopping until he was several blocks away, panting and shivering. He glanced around, expecting to see the shadow lurking behind him. But there was nothing. Only the quiet, empty street and the distant hum of the city. For a while, Jack wandered aimlessly, unsure of where to go. His apartment was no longer safe. He couldn't go to the police. What would he tell them? That a shadow was stalking him? They'd think he was crazy. After what felt like hours, he found himself standing in front of a 24-hour diner, its neon sign flickering in the gloom. Desperate for human company, Jack stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as he entered. The place was nearly empty, save for a tired-looking waitress and a couple of old men nursing cups of coffee. Jack slid into a booth at the back, his eyes scanning the windows nervously. The waitress approached, offering him a menu, but he barely glanced at it. "Coffee," he murmured. "Just coffee, please." The waitress nodded, casting him a curious glance before retreating. Jack leaned back in his seat, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe there had never been a shadow at all. But then he saw it. In the reflection of the diner's window, just behind him, the shadow stood, tall and thin, its eyes gleaming faintly in the glass. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched it raise one hand, placing it on his shoulder. He spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Only empty air. Terrified, Jack turned back to the window. The shadow was still there, still smiling with those cold, pale eyes. And in that moment, Jack understood. It wasn't following him anymore. It was with him. It had taken root in his reflection, bound to him like a parasite. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would be there lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Jack closed his eyes, a low, despairing moan escaping his lips. He was trapped. There was no escape from the shadow that had claimed him. And as he sat there, trembling in the cold, fluorescent light of the diner, the shadow's whispering filled his ears once more. Louder now, more insistent, as if it were speaking directly to his soul. "Let me in, Jack," it murmured, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Let me in, and I'll set you free." Jack knew then that he would never be alone again. The shadow would follow him, haunt him, until the day he gave in, until he surrendered his mind, his body, his very essence to the darkness. And when that day came, the shadow would no longer be a mere reflection. It would be him.